There's mistakes that we all make, there's mistakes that men make with fasting, and then there's common mistakes that women make with fasting. And the unfortunate thing is there's so many moving pieces for ladies that it makes it very tough. So I want to address what I think are the common intermittent fasting or even prolonged fasting mistakes that women make that realistically you probably don't know you're making because, well, they're a little bit advanced, but I'll do my best to simplify them so that it's easy so that you have a playbook. Jumping right into it, the first one is fasting the week before your period. I'm not gonna go out and say it's like this tremendous mistake and you're ruining everything, but I think you will find that if you do not fast during the luteal phase, the phase right before your period, well, I feel like you're gonna probably have a better outcome. You see, this is when progesterone is at its highest. Now, progesterone obviously has reproductive properties, that's the main thing, but it's also highly metabolic. It has metabolic effects too. The American Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology had published a study that found that progesterone actually triggered more fat deposition, triggered the deposits of fat, so you're storing more fat, but also triggered more hyperinsulinemia. Now, the way that it's doing this is because it's triggering all kinds of just metabolic effects there. So when you look at it to the naked eye, you think, well, that's a perfect time to fast. I want to fast when my body wants to store fat. Well, not necessarily, because that means you're going to have every sort of kind of like hormonal disadvantage when you're fasting, and it's going to make the fast very difficult. But even more important than that, progesterone is going to promote catabolism, okay, which means it's going to break down more muscle. So it's probably the worst time that you would be fasting, because if you're fasting during that time, it's just going to accelerate the muscle wasting. We don't want that. Fasting can be very beneficial when it comes down to muscle preservation, but not as preserving a muscle if you are actually just eating, okay? So during this period of time, because you are going to be somewhat hyperinsulinemic, meaning you're gonna bring in, you're having higher levels of insulin, you may want to consider going like a low carb, kind of paleo, even keto approach this week and take a break from the fasting. That way you're still suppressing insulin a little bit, you're not having these big spikes in it, but you're not fasting and promoting more catabolism and muscle breakdown. Plus, I just think that you will feel better not fasting during this phase. The next one is if you're trying to rebalance hormones or you're trying to conceive, you may really want to hold off on fasting during your actual ovulation period. Okay? Now, again, if you're trying to conceive, clear as day. If you're trying to rebalance, you have to remember that when we are fasting, what's happening is we're triggering a stress response. Okay, now we know that fasting is going to increase cortisol levels from various studies. Okay, so if you're fasting during that ovulation phase, that's sending kind of a mixed signal to your body, right? Your body might be saying, oh, this person's not necessarily ready for a reproduction. Well, the Annals of Epidemiology took a look at 400 women, and they found that when they were stressed and cortisol levels were high during ovulation, there was a 40% less chance of conceiving. Now, you may or may not be trying to conceive, but it's still going to play a role in your overall cycle, right? Like if you are not properly releasing an egg and things are out of whack because your cortisol levels are elevated, you could see how that could kind of spearhead a whole like just catapult of different things, right? The next one is true for men and women, but it has to be put out there because I think it's very important. A lot of times ladies like to go and do these longer fasts, and quite candidly, a lot of them can really do them well because have a little bit more body fat on hand. The body can utilize fat as a fuel source a little bit better in women than can in men. So yeah, I'm not opposed to that, but it's very important that you do get electrolytes in so that you can sustain those fasts in a healthy way from sort of a mineral balance and electrolyte balance. Okay, the last thing you want to be doing is sending mixed signals to your body. So if you're doing anything longer than like an 18-hour fast, you really should be bringing electrolytes into the mix, okay? Especially if you're exercising, you're gonna be losing more. Talk about this all the time, okay? Suppressed insulin levels during a fast or doing keto or anything like that equals more water being evacuated and the kidneys expelling more water and therefore more electrolytes and minerals. The electrolyte that I recommend is called Element. I put a link down below for it, but the cool thing is Element's a big sponsor of my channel, so because of that, this is a free sample pack. So you can use that link down below and get 8 packs of Element electrolytes. You just pay shipping. So totally free outside of shipping. That way you can try them out, see if you want to use it during your fasting regimen. If it works for you, great. If it doesn't, no big deal. You're out a couple bucks for shipping. So again, that link is down below, and a big thank you to Element for the continued support on this channel. So you got to try that. Plus it makes fasting a lot more fun when you can actually sip on an electrolyte that tastes good. They have all kinds of cool flavors like the lemon lime. They have some mango chili, just really interesting flavors. So again, that link is down below, or you can go to drinklmnt.com/Thomas. Again, drinkelement.com/Thomas. This next one is a really big one and probably the most important one. Okay, it's going to be fasting too long and too frequently. So the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism had published a study that demonstrated that fasting affects luteinizing hormone pulses. Luteinizing hormone pulses are very important, okay? That is what's signaling the ovulation process to begin. That's what's signaling this whole thing. Now, in people that are already lean and women that are already lean, like under 20-ish% body fat, this is even more pronounced. So you have to be extra careful. Okay, anytime you are stressed or fasting and eliciting stress within the body, you're going to sort of attenuate those luteinizing hormone pulses. That affects your cycle. So it's like the biggest catalyst that you could probably have, right? If you don't have that pulse, you're not kickstarting the process. Okay, so you gotta keep those pulses in balance. So what I would recommend, if you're doing any kind of like 24-hour to 36-hour fasting period, that you don't fast inside of 7 days of each other. So have at least like a 7 to 10 day period between those 24+ hour fasts. That is very important so that you're not allowing those luteinizing hormone like pulses to become disrupted. If you're trying to conceive, then you should not do anything longer than a 48-hour fast. And if you are a beginner that is not fat adapted, meaning you're gonna have a stronger stress response to a fast, you really wanna keep it under 24 hours until you feel like you are truly adapted and fasting isn't as much of a heavy stressor to you. Now when we talk about frequency, this is very important because, again, I see it a lot with ladies where they like how they feel with fasting, so they wanna start doing it like every day. Well, there's a study that was published in the journal Reproductive Medicine that took a look at 80 women. Okay, now this was 80 women pre-Ramadan. Okay, now hear me out on this. At the beginning of this, there were 11% of the 80 women that were demonstrating like abnormalities to their menstrual cycle based upon like a questionnaire. Okay, during Ramadan, after Ramadan, that number went to 30% when they were fasting like for those 30 days. Those women that only fasted for 15 days of Ramadan had much less in the way of abnormalities. So it is sort of dose dependent, if you want to call it that, right? How much fasting we do can absolutely affect things. So when you look at Ramadan, if they were fasting half the amount, there was less abnormality. If they were fasting the whole amount, there was much more abnormality. So we do need to pay attention to that. So what I would typically recommend here is fast every other day. Okay, just be safe with it. Fast every other day. It's that simple. Fast every other day with the exception of that luteal phase. Take that time off to go paleo, keto, low carb, whatever. So that way you're doing like 3 weeks out of the month with fasting every other day and 1 week that you're taking off. This would probably be good for men too, just for different reasons. The reality is it's probably a great strategy nevertheless. This next one is not eating enough during the eating window. This is super common with women. Okay, it's super common with men too, but I would say I probably see it 2 to 1 in women versus men. It's again, your stomach shrinks, it's easy to not eat. And there was a study that was published in the European Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology and Reproductive Biology. And this was interesting because it took a look at leptin, which is very important. Okay, leptin, especially in women, what it does is it senses how much fat is on hand. And if it senses that enough fat is on hand, it's gonna say, yes, this person is a good candidate and is in good shape to conceive. Remember, even if you're not trying to conceive, this is still kind of the basis for how your reproductive system is working. Are you eligible to conceive, if you want to call it that? Well, leptin decreases when we fast. That's no brainer. When we're not eating, we're not going to have as much leptin signal, and it's telling your body, okay, hey, this person is starving, there's not a lot of leptin, maybe they're not the best candidate. And now this is not a huge deal because it's happening in sort of an acute fashion, right? As long as we eat enough when we break our fast, it's not a big deal. But if leptin gets chronically low because we're not eating enough during our eating period, then it's sending this consistent signal. And that becomes a longer term issue that not just affects your cycle, but affects how you're actually getting results within your fast too. Okay, you're probably fasting because you want body composition changes. And if you start throwing off the estrogen cycles and the progesterone cycles, you're gonna throw that off entirely. And it's gonna be a lot harder to pinpoint what is causing you issues and potential plateaus. What's interesting is that the European Journal of Endocrinology published a study that found that leptin and estrogen were actually interlinked. And you may think that estrogen is bad because there's so much content out there saying that it's bad, but when it comes down to women, estrogen is great. Not too much and not the bad kind like 1,7-hydroxyestradiol, but good, healthy estrogen is what we want in women. Now, estrogen is going to allow you to feel satiated. It's actually a great time to fast, by the way, during your estrogen phase. That's like the best time to fast because estrogen promotes satiety and you don't feel hungry. You start messing that up, and yet estrogen linked with leptin, you're gonna feel hungry all the time because your estrogen levels aren't going up the way they should. It can just really disrupt things. So again, keeping that balance there to make sure. One of the ways that you can get additional calories in is just by stacking your fat calories a little bit towards the front part of your eating window. That way you're not filling yourself up with a bunch of veggies, filling yourself up with a bunch of carbohydrates, you're filling yourself up with nutrient-dense and calorically dense fats, and then kind of easing off the calories later on into the eating period. Which leads me into the next mistake that is very, very important for women, and that is eating too much during the late phase of your eating window. This is important for men and women, but there are studies that demonstrate it's even more pronounced in women. So there's a study that was published in the journal BMC Public Health, and it took a look at 8,153 men and women, okay, followed them for 5 years, okay, and it measured kind of like when they eat and everything like that. They found that men, when they ate later in the evening, they had a 100% increased risk of developing obesity. That's a lot. Women, 200%, so double that. So same situation, women eating late at night, they gained twice as much or had twice as much of a risk of developing obesity than men. Now, there could be a lot of reasons to that when you start looking at the mechanisms of action. Again, you have different things going on with women that could relate to insulin resistance or hyperinsulinemia, depending on the phase. So like if they're hyperinsulinemic and you are in the progesterone phase and you're overeating at night, then yes, potentially have a lot more storage potential, right? I'm digressing a little bit, but that's kind of how I'm putting it together. So what I would recommend is breaking your fast a little bit earlier in the day, starting your fast a little bit earlier the night before, breaking your fast around 2 or 3 p.m., stacking most of your calories before 6 p.m., and then if you do eat after 6 p.m., make it smaller protein-rich meals that aren't as calorically dense and can satiate you a little bit more. And just to recap, fasting the week before your period. Okay, if you're trying to conceive or rebalance, don't fast during your ovulation phase. Okay, next up in the mistakes is going to be fasting too frequently or for too long. Next up is going to be not eating enough during your eating window, and finally eating too late into your eating window. So as always, again, I'll see you tomorrow.